Now, I know some people are curious what goes on in the mind of the storyteller. So today, I thought it would be fun if I showed you my actual home campaign notebook so you could see the kind of things that I prepare before the game begins. Huh, that's weird. All the pages are blank. Today, we're going to talk about how to outline and structure your campaign on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I'm the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, I'm a storyteller who knows how to shorten any epic campaign down to a one-shot. It's simple, 3 letters, TPK. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. And welcome back to Storytelling in Pathfinder 2e, a series where we take a look at the tips, tricks, and advice that Paizo offers storytellers to help us be more successful at the gaming table. Now, it is important to note, this series is intended for storytellers of every skill level, from beginner to advanced, and even if Pathfinder 2e is not your preferred game, I still invite you to be a part of the conversation because you can always learn something to bring back to your preferred system. So, regardless of how long you've been playing or what your favorite game is, I hope this conversation is helpful to you. Now, for the past several months in this series, we've been looking at the different modes of play in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, but we've gone through those 3 modes of play, and the time has come to move on to a new topic, outlining campaigns. Now, you all know that my preferred title for myself when it comes to RPGs is storyteller. Sure, I've used terms like Game Master and Dungeon Master over the years, but storytelling is really at the heart of what I enjoy about this hobby. So storyteller is the title I love, and a good expression of what I love to do with this hobby. And when it comes to outlining campaigns, this is the portion of being a game master where that role as storyteller becomes the most prominent. As a game master, you have the responsibility of crafting a narrative, at least partially, that your players are going to get to interact with and affect the outcome of. You are, in effect, writing a story. So it is worth asking, how should we, as storytellers, structure our narrative, structure our games, and build this fantastic story that our players get to experience? Now, let me say up front that the model that Paizo gives us and that we're going to be discussing for a while is not the only model that you can use in developing a narrative for your games. In fact, I would go so far as to say that my personal model of developing a narrative for games is different enough that I would say it is a different model. There are similarities between what Paizo recommends and how I approach things, but at the end of the day, I have different priorities in how I try to construct stories. There are a wide variety of options and ways that you can construct a tale, but Paizo does give us a very top-down model of how to construct stories, and I do think it is a solid model, especially for anyone who is stepping into the role of Game Master for the first time. So we're going to spend some time talking about that model, we're going to break apart the different elements that Paizo gives us, and we're going to take a look at what it takes to tell a story using game systems such as Pathfinder 2nd Edition. If you're interested in reading up on this content, you can read the material that I'm going to be covering from pages 36 to 51 of the Gamemastery Guide for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and those are the pages that we're going to be revisiting for the next several videos in this series. However, before we dive into this conversation, let me remind you to do all of that YouTube stuff really quick. Don't forget to like the video, share it, and subscribe to the channel. You can check out my free Discord group and my Patreon page. Both of those will be linked in the video description. And as always, the most important thing you can do is jump down into the comments section and share your insights, your thoughts, and be a part of the conversation. I love hearing what you all have to say. Alright, let's get started. So as I mentioned in the introduction, Paizo gives a very top-down model of how to build out a campaign for you and your players. I would like to stress this is not the only model, and if you have another model that you prefer to use, by all means go with the model that you're comfortable with. Some people will use a bottom-up model. I use what I call the goalpost method of trying to tell stories. There are a variety of ways of constructing stories, but Paizo in specific gives us a model of outlining campaigns in what is essentially 3 parts. The campaign structure, the adventure design, and the encounter design, and you can think of this as 3 tiers, moving from the largest and then focusing in on more and more specific subjects. So you start with the big picture of the campaign structure itself. Then, once you have that picture in focus, you zoom in, and you start designing the different adventures that will be part of the campaign. And then, once you have those adventures designed, you zoom in another step and start designing specific encounters that your party is going to deal with. And an important part of this design process is to note that as you are zooming in, as you're going through these different steps, the larger picture that you are dealing with helps inform the details that you fill in on the smaller pictures that you create. When you are doing the campaign structure itself in step 1, you are painting with a very broad brush and outlining what are significant themes or ideas that are associated with your story. Then, when you step into the adventure design, you are creating more detail of the different story arcs that are going to fall under that campaign structure. And then finally, with encounter design, which is the crunchiest mechanically, you are again using those ideas from the adventure and campaign steps to help fill in the specific details of the encounters that your players are going through. Now, before I break those 3 steps down in a little bit more detail, there is an important thing that I would like to clarify about this process of campaign structure, adventure design, and encounter design, and something that I think Paizo notes that is very important in these different steps. In the Gamemastery Guide, you will see Paizo takes the time to remind you about player input on these different steps, from campaign structure to adventure design, down to even specific encounters. You want your players to be part of the storytelling process. Now, if you're a fan of this channel, you know that that is not a big surprise. I'm a big advocate for game masters and players working together to create a good story. But just remember, as a game master, creating this picture is not all on you. Your players can and should be part of crafting that narrative. But let's talk about those different steps individually and kind of discuss what is going to go into each of those steps. The first and biggest one is campaign structure, and there's a couple of different things that you want to answer at this point in creating your story. Number 1, how long is your story going to be? Number 2, what are the big ideas of your story? And number 3, what are the consequences of your story? That first question is very simple. How long is the story going to be, or more importantly, how long is this campaign going to run? Some groups run very short games, which are basically just one-shots that happen to feature the same characters, but are otherwise unconnected. However, when you step up to connected stories, you want to ask yourself, how long is this story going to run? A level 1 to level 20 campaign is probably going to take you 1.5 years, 2 years, maybe 3 years to successfully complete. But you don't have to run all the way from level 1 to level 20. One of the best campaigns that I ever ran only lasted for about 3 levels, and it played out over the course of about 2.5 months one summer. I knew ahead of time that my friends were going to be in from school that long, and I only had a limited time to tell the story, so I designed a story that was intended for just a couple of months, and because I knew that I only had that much time, it informed the decisions I made in planning the story. The second question is, what are the big ideas of your story, or what you might commonly hear referred to as the theme. Now, not every storyteller necessarily uses theme, and sometimes storytellers may let their game go a little while before they start picking out a particular theme that they want to focus on. That's okay. Theme is certainly something you can sit around, ruminate on for a bit, and sometimes that's going to give you a better outcome than if you tried to force a particular theme in a story. So don't feel like you have to lock this one in, but it is important to think about what are the themes, what are the big ideas that are going to be communicated in this story. And for a simple example, a party of champions and a party of rogues are likely to deal with very different themes in the stories that would be associated with those groups. Thinking about that ahead of time is worth doing. And then there's the idea of consequences. This is arguably more important for groups that set multiple games in the same setting or world, but for a story to be satisfying, there must be some sense of consequence to the actions that your characters perform. And so as a storyteller, when you are painting this very big picture of what the campaign structure is going to be, you kind of want to ask the question, what is this final picture going to look like for good or for ill? If my party succeeds, what does that mean for the world? If my party fails, what does that mean as well? For the second step, we have adventure design, and the term adventure design that Paizo uses here, I think is best viewed as story arcs. If you can imagine breaking this big picture into individual chunks that players will move throughout the course of the game, then an adventure is kind of a portion of the painting that is going to inform the final larger piece that is created. Story arcs are not the whole story, but they are in some ways a self-contained story that serve the larger product, and as a storyteller you do want to ask, what do I want these smaller arcs to look like as I design them? Now, adventure design is where you get to start introducing some variety to the story that you're creating. Maybe your players get to deal with a very political, intrigue-heavy portion of the story over here, but then maybe a later portion after they leave the town looks suspiciously like a Treasure Island-style pirate adventure. As characters move from story arc to story arc, you get a chance to introduce some variety to what the players are experiencing. And though there are connecting threads from one story arc to another, each story arc in and of itself does kind of play out as its own individual, smaller tale that your players will experience. For adventure design, Paizo really focuses in on two particular elements that we will discuss in more depth in future videos, which are adventure styles and adventure threats. The concept of style, as Paizo presents it, can almost be looked at as sort of the genre of that story arc, while threats is more an examination of the dangers or opponents that PCs must deal with as they go through the story arc, but both of those will inform the overall adventure design for that story arc. Now, the final step that Paizo gives us is what they call encounter design, and I will admit here that it does kind of feel like Paizo skipped a step a little bit from adventure to encounter. When I think adventure design, I think of the kind of story arc that might play out over the course of 1 or 2 months at my gaming table, and when I think encounter design, I often think of like individual encounters where a single session might have 4 or 5 different encounters that my players have to deal with. So it does feel like Paizo kind of skipped over the session design portion of the conversation, but really and truthfully, session design is mostly a building block of different encounters, so I think that's why Paizo doesn't include that specific part of the breakdown. But in encounter design, what you are doing is you're zooming in on the most detailed portion of crafting a narrative. Rather than painting with the broad strokes of themes and consequence or styles and threats, when you're doing encounter design, you're talking about the bandit camp. You're talking about the mysterious library. You're talking about specific locations with defined boundaries and an established population of some kind. Encounter design gets into the nitty-gritty of what your players have to deal with, and as a result, allows for the most variety in what you do and present in your story. By the way, here's another pattern from Paizo's discussion of campaign structure. You'll notice every time you take a step down, Paizo has a conversation about how there is more variety available as you get more detailed in what you're designing. In other words, as you get more specific, Paizo encourages you to really let that creative portion of your brain run wild and ask, what can I do with all of these details? Now, we already did encounter mode play in previous videos in the series, so we're not going to spend a ton of time on encounter design in this portion of the series, but one of the things we will focus on in that part of the conversation is how to do variety and to do it well as a storyteller. But those are the basic steps: campaign structure, adventure design, encounter design. The last thing I want to talk about in this video is, as a storyteller, you want to be mindful of the through line in that design process. The advantage in this structure that Paizo gives is that it establishes a very clear way as a storyteller when you're doing the different parts of planning your story for those different parts to influence one another, to be connected to one another, and for there to be a very clear path through the story that makes it engaging for your players. In other words, when you paint with the big picture, that big picture influences the middle picture. The middle picture influences the small picture, and when you take it all together, the story is functional and something that your players will enjoy. And it's pretty easy to see how you can do this. Let's start with campaign structure. One of the things you're doing in that big, broad, thematic portion of your storytelling is you're establishing the goals of your story. What do I want to do in this story? What kind of story do I want to tell? Where am I going? What's happening? I'm painting with a very big picture. What are the goals of my story? Well, when you move into that second step, adventure design, remember we talked about one of the things that Paizo discusses is the threats in the adventure. You've got villains who are doing something during those adventures that your players have to deal with. Those villains have goals. What are those goals? Well, those goals are likely to be influenced by, if not directly determined by, the larger story goals that you set up way back when you were doing the campaign structure. The goals of the story influence the goals of the villains. And if you take the villain goals in adventure design and go down to the encounter design level, well, what are the goals and motivations of the enemies in that small moment that's going to feed into those larger villain goals, larger story goals? The thread runs both ways and helps establish a logical narrative connection that is going to be satisfying to your players. So that is the basic top-down model that Paizo offers storytellers to help you as you're trying to plan out your next game. In future videos in this series, we're going to break apart some of the important elements of campaign structure, we're going to break apart some of the important elements of adventure design, and we're going to break apart a few of the elements associated with encounter design as well, and we're going to look at what those different pieces of the puzzle mean so that we can see how they fit together to form the larger picture. But for now, we've got a pretty good bird's eye view of how this model of storytelling works. So let me turn the conversation over to you. Do you use this model of storytelling, or do you take a different approach in how you craft your campaigns? What do you think are some of the strengths of this model of crafting a campaign, and what do you think are some of the weaknesses that a storyteller might encounter? Also, do you have any specific questions that you would like me to address as this conversation moves forward? Let me know in the comments section down below. Also, don't forget to like the video, share the video, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.